Thanks very much. Good afternoon. I'm really proud of the University of Maryland students for organizing this and very happy to be part of it. Today I'd like to talk to you about how we define ourselves and how that question helps inform us about the world broadly, including regions like the Middle East that seem so complex and hard to understand, a region that's undergoing dramatic change. And I'm going to start by depositing a seemingly strange question in your mind, and I could come back to it a little bit later on. And the question is, why is Barack Obama black? And I mean, we take it for granted. Obviously, Barack Obama is half black and half white, but if I were to say he was white, it would be a very strange identification. So I'm going to deposit that in your mind, and I'll come back to it later because I think thinking about this issue helps us understand the complexity of identity for other people. And I think it actually sheds some light on the region that I study very much, and that is the Middle East, including how we understand identity and the evolution of identity in that region. So let me start by telling you a little bit about what I do, which is for the past several decades, I have been studying Arab public opinion specifically in the Middle East. And for more than a decade, I've been doing actually public opinion polling to know not only what Arabs think, that matters, but really for understanding what I say is the prism through which people see the world. I'm really less interested in opinion per se. Opinion is important and sometimes can be telling at any given time, but I use public opinion poll to understand the prism through which people see the world. What is the framework of reference that they employ when they render their opinion? And you can't understand that without understanding their core identity. Therefore, for me, understanding identity is critical for understanding not only what people think, but also how they behave in the world. And understanding how that identity changes matters for understanding politics broadly. And I want to suggest to you that actually understanding the human condition, the human experience, in engaging that early question I started with, which is why Obama is black, gives far more insight than all the local expertise you're going to get on the Middle East. And so let me first start with a finding that I have. Aside from the indirect questions that I use to get at people's identity, I also ask direct questions. And I'm going to give you some of the results, particularly in the decade that preceded these incredible Arab uprisings that we started seeing in 2010. So one of the questions I ask is acknowledging that people are complex. We all are. We all have multiple identities. And certainly Arabs, like other people, do as well. And so an Egyptian is at once an Egyptian and a Muslim or a Christian, and an Arab, a citizen of the world, and much more. And that's true about all of us. So I grant them that. But what I ask them is which one of these identities is more important to them today. And so trace that over a decade to see how that identity evolved over that decade and supplemented that with some indirect questions. And what I found over that decade is that people's identification with the state declined over the decade. That is, people were less likely to say they're Jordanian first or Egyptian first or Saudi first. Their Arab identity, the likelihood that they would say they're Arab first, remained very strong but didn't increase much. And their Islamic identity, saying that they're Muslim first, increased quite a bit over that decade. Now, I want to engage that issue, and particularly with an interpretation. A lot of people interpreted this early on by asserting that this is essentially representative of what we see as a rise in political Islam, particularly militant political Islam, or at least puritanical political Islam. And part of that had to do with our own experience in America of what we witnessed over the past decade and a half, particularly after the tragedy of 9/11, and the response to that tragedy, how we defined and looked at the Middle East through the prism of that tragedy. And I want to suggest to you that that is an incorrect interpretation of these trends in identity. I want to give you some argument why it's incorrect, and two, I'm going to present to you a different argument that is closer to the human condition, to the human experience, that is far more enlightening to us in understanding why people assert those identities and what is the consequence of that assertion. What does it mean? Does it have implications for all of us and certainly for them? So first, just a couple of pieces of evidence that questions this rise in political Islam. Number one, right after 9/11, for the whole decade, we were asking questions, particularly after the rise of Al-Qaeda, what aspect of Al-Qaeda people embraced, if any? The fact that Al-Qaeda was calling for a puritanical, Taliban-like Islamic State, the fact that Al-Qaeda stood up to the US, the fact that Al-Qaeda was speaking for certain causes, and so forth. And of course, many people didn't have any empathy with any aspect of Al-Qaeda. But what we found is those who said they embraced their agenda over Taliban-like state were less than 10%. Actually, most of the time, less than 6%. That's not what they embraced. The second point I want to make. In 2012, on the eve of the Egyptian elections, I conducted a poll in Egypt. And I asked people whether they wanted Sharia Islamic law to be a basis of the Constitution. And I had 2/3 say yes. And by the way, it's very hard for a Muslim to say that they don't accept Sharia law. I'll come back to that a little bit later. It's part and parcel of being a Muslim. And for that, actually, the word Sharia derives from the same word as legitimacy in Arabic. And you can understand how that works. But that hardly tells you the story, because the question is how they interpret that. So I follow up with another question. And that question is, do you want Sharia law to be implemented literally, including to penal code, or do you want it to be adapted to modern time? And I had over 80% say adapted to modern time. A third example, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamic political group in Egypt, they won the presidency. And obviously, a lot of people thought that was the rise of political Islam. It was. In part, they were very organized. And yet, if you look at the election in round one, when the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood, that is the best organized group in the post-Mubarak era, he got only 26% of the vote. So I'm suggesting to you that that's not the right interpretation. So what is the right interpretation? I'd like to present to you a different theory of how we select identity. I think the selection of identity is animated by two rules on two different ends of the spectrum. One rule is that we devalue that aspect of identity that does not deliver on our core aspirations, and we jump on the bandwagon of that aspect of identity that delivers, or we hope that will deliver on our aspirations. On the other end of the spectrum, we rally behind that aspect of our identity that is most under assault. We are what we have to defend. And on the one end of that identity, that rule, if you look at what happened over the past decade, we know that the states were seen to have failed in delivering on any aspirations of the people, whether they're freedom, whether they're raising their heads in the world on foreign policy, whether they're delivering food or jobs. That we have known. We've seen that in the public opinion polls over the whole period. And magnifying that in rejecting the state is that when you are in authoritarian regimes, it's very hard to differentiate ruler from state. If you were born in Libya, you are most likely, you have known no other ruler but Gaddafi, who was in office for over 40 years. And if you didn't like Gaddafi, you didn't like Libya. Obviously, that is a metaphor for it. So you devalue that aspect of your identity. But on the other end, I think one very important dimension that has not been fully understood and explored is that we all rally behind that aspect of identity that is most under assault. How else do you explain the fact that Barack Obama asserts his blackness over his whiteness, or that we as a society see him through that prism? Because if you look at the Muslim world over that whole decade, yes, a lot of people, when they say I'm Muslim first, they mean multiple things. You do have people who belong to political Islam. You have moderates and you have extremists. You have people who are religious and people who are secular. But many people who assert that identity are asserting it in defiance, because that's a decade when Islam in the Arab world, particularly in other countries, was seen to be under assault. We have seen it in the public opinion poll when you ask people, particularly in the post-9/11 era, whether they thought what drives American foreign policy and Western policy in the region. Weakening the Muslim world was up there very high. And so many people who, when they were saying I'm Muslim first, were, I don't have to apologize for the fact that I'm a Muslim. I don't have to apologize for the fact that Sharia is the law of Islam. It is a defiant strategy. And I find that to be true for me personally as an American who goes to the region very often. I'm a critic of American foreign policy often when we do things wrong. But when I'm outside, when I'm in Europe, when I'm in the Middle East, when I'm speaking on foreign television, when I'm in a conference, and I find that a lot of people are unjustly attacking the United States of America, I find myself asserting my Americanism first and foremost. If you think about what happened to us after 9/11, the morning before we were Democrats and Republicans, many of us were not even nationalistic. Our president had less than 50% support. And the morning after, he got 90% support when everybody said, we're all American, we're all behind you when we were under threat. The same thing happens under identity. One final example from the Middle East itself that's not related to the rise of Islamic identity. The one year where we had a spike in state identification through that 10-year period was right after the Iraq War. And my interpretation of that is when people were terrified by the anarchy and the dissolution of the state of Iraq, and regimes were saying, would you rather have Cairo or Baghdad, they would rather have the state. And there was a spike in the state identification. We see that also in another country. Not all Arab countries have the same identification over time. They change. The change I talked to you about is aggregate. But Lebanon, one of the most sectarian countries in the Middle East, in fact, the most sectarian country in the Middle East, because there's not a single sect in Lebanon constitutes the majority of the population. And yet, when you ask people, are you first Sunni or Shia, Christian or Druze, invariably, every single sect, the majority say they're Lebanese first. And my interpretation of that is, again, because they've witnessed the civil war, they're fearful of the civil war, they're fearful of the anarchy, they rally behind the state spikes despite the sectarianism. So what does this all mean? Well, let me end with two conclusions. One conclusion is about the importance of issue in the Arab world. When you assert something like you are a Muslim first or an Arab first, but not a Jordanian first or a Saudi first, you may mean many things by it. You might mean this is a religious identity, political identity, cultural identity. Whatever identity you mean by it, it has one consequence that's important. It means that you are identifying yourself with other people, Arabs and Muslims, who are outside your own state boundaries. You care about, if you're an Egyptian, it means you care about Iraqis. If you're Moroccan, it means you care about Palestinians. We've seen that throughout the whole decade that preceded the Arab uprisings and since. That puts foreign policy center stage in every place, even places that are obsessed with their internal affairs. And the dignity that people were seeking in the Arab world, in the uprisings, isn't just defined in the relationship between them and their rulers, but between them, their nations, and the outside world. They want to raise their heads at home, and they want to raise their heads abroad. And we have to understand that when we think about the Middle East. But the second and final conclusion I want to make relates to the very question I started with about identity. And that is, identity, like dignity, is a relationship. Yes, at any given time, people come with preconceived notions of their identity. But that identity, or that aspect of identity that they embrace at any given time, cannot be divorced from that which we do in our relations with them, whether we threaten them or assure them, whether we display aggression or we display compassion. Thank you very much.